Welcome to the Romania River channel. In my series on the Syrian Civil War, using the video game of the RTS genre Syrian Warfare as a source for the Russian/Syrian side of the conflict, which I will then juxtapose with sources and information from Western outlets and Western governments to try and get more or less a more objective, truthful version of events as they are depicted in the game, and try and get the root of things, basically, because the conflict itself is both highly controversial, highly polarizing, and to be honest, the truth is not really being served by either side, as things tend to be embellished. As such, I would ask anybody who wants to get involved in discussions in the comments to respect each other, even if you are on different sides. Like, for example, you are for the Free Syrian Army and you meet somebody who is pro-Syrian government or Russian in affiliation. I thank you and enjoy the video. Historical notes: Latakia Coast. Latakia was considered the key to the Syrian war for a reason. By losing access to the coastline, Damascus authorities could not permanently maintain resistance to the jihadis and the moderate opposition backed up by the West. On top of that, the conflict was fueled by the Turkish government aspiring to regain control over the once wealthy Ottoman region. Although the majority of Turkmen residing in the area support the official Damascus government, part of the population had no objections to reuniting with their former homeland or motherland. Having accumulated the military power during the first Syrian truce in 2012, the Turkmen militant forces, supplied with money, weapons, vehicles by the Turkish government and the quickly expanding al-Nusra Front, began carrying out an invasion from the adjacent Idlib on the northern parts of Latakia in an attempt to extend the battle action to this region as well. From this point of view, the information offered is both accurate and also from the perspective of the Syrian narrative. It's not, as far as I know, within the Russian narrative, but the Russians within this kind of stage of the war, or the civil war per se, were not actively involved. They were supporting the Syrian government via support, and I believe, how should I put this, as advisors. Now, as for the whole support of jihadis and moderate opposition with quotation marks, well, during that time there was still moderate opposition, i.e. people who actually wanted to get a democratic government or reforms, or basically just Assad out of office, but with no real plan what to do afterwards. They were still existing in the northern parts of Syria to a certain degree. The weapons mentioned within the historical note, however, they were given to them, amongst which I believe were Stinger surface-to-air missiles, would eventually end up in the hands of ISIS, who within the 2012-2013 period was actually still under Al-Qaeda, with the name Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Syria, if I'm not mistaken. And to a certain degree that also explains how, for example, in 2014 or 2015 there's Russian Air Force reports of airplanes targeting Stinger sets around or in the vicinity of Palmyra. Now, besides the whole support from the West, the Turkish idea that they want to regain territory lost during the fall of the Ottoman Empire is actually, well, it's a wee bit muddled here, so to say, because there are nationalist elements within Turkey that want to see the Turkish borders as outlined by the Turkish Republic in 1920, not the current ones that they have. And the ones that were outlined by the Turkish Republic were, to put it bluntly, how should I put this? There were significant chunks of Syria missing. There were portions of, what was it? Bulgaria, and I believe almost up to the coast of Romania, which were also taken, and I believe the eastern parts towards Azerbaijan and so on were also quite a wee bit different. But for our purposes, the borders in the area of Syria with the 1920 true peace proposal are the important bit. So if the Turkish government was under the sway of the respective nationalist mentality, then this would to a certain degree be accurate. Now, it depends on you if you want to actually believe that. There is reports from Turkish whistleblowers that in 2013, or 2012-2013, there were leaks of chemical weapons from Turkey to Syria, which may have explained the whole East Ghouta gas attack, but it's basically a whole clusterfuck. It will probably take decades to unravel anything, and that's if anything will ever be unraveled. The one thing that will be said though is the weapon support is pretty much a given. If it was a given towards both jihadis and moderates is in question, but military support in weapons, vehicles, and money was given. And the Turkmens within the northwestern parts of Syria, certain groups within that area do really want to be part of Turkey again, so that is also accurate. Now let's also deal with the personal note on the side. After I escaped, I found shelter at my relatives' home at the coast. All my comrades who have escaped with me have been somehow allocated temporary housing, and now we are operating together as a local police reinforcement team. Oh Latakia, serving here used to be such a pleasure. Tender, glorious sea, beautiful coastal mountains, but now this corner of paradise is gradually turning into hell. The majority of the province population openly supports Damascus rule, but that does not prevent entire rebel units from appearing here and there and terrorizing local people. Latakia is too tasty a peace, and its collapse will deprive the government forces of any ability to resist any further. I am fully aware of that, and I am not surprised that the tension has increased so dramatically in recent days. Allegedly, Turkey actively assists the rebel fighters operating here as it strives to reinforce or restore the former glory of the Ottoman Empire. Oh well, I'm not running anywhere. No matter what happens, I'm staying here, dead or alive. Now versus the historical notes, it's adding in more or less a personal touch. What happened to the protagonist in the game after the last mission. The one thing that's kind of interesting and to a fairly high degree historically accurate is the fact that the local police force was basically turned into, it depends on the police forces in question, but usually either battalions or even divisions created from former police officers, basically. This has actually happened in the latter stages of the Syrian Civil War, which I would believe we are in currently. There is a distinct amount of proof that at least some of the Damascus government's allies use under 18 soldiers, that is, child soldiers. I'm not too sure if it's also Damascus itself, but as this mission shows, they were already more or less conscripting police forces in the military. The fact that the police force, at least in the previous mission, was supposedly formed up of mostly military veterans, kind of excuses that, but I doubt all police forces within Syria were of the similar level of preparedness, so to say. And to be honest, the mission after this one also hints at how things start degrading quite rapidly for the Syrian military in terms of manpower. But let's continue.
Awaiting instructions, over. Falcon 4, this is Haji 2. Begin patrolling the streets at once. Establish control at the intersection. There have been attacks on civilians using that road. Be careful, Lieutenant. The bandits are heading for the shore, and some other large gangs with support from the Turks have been seeping into our territory. Over.
Copy that, Haji 2. Falcon 4. Over and out.
One would ask why rebels would be attacking people they'd ostensibly want to liberate, so to say, or basically why would freedom fighters attack the people they depend on? Well, from a political point of view, the Latakia region has always been more or less pro-Assad. So from that point of view, in a civil war type setting wherein, how should I put this, human rights and other such first world luxuries get suspended indefinitely, yeah, you generally do not have many compunctions as a rebel of attacking people you'd view more or less as enemies. That said, however, there's probably some exaggeration here on the part of the Damascus government, because I doubt they would have been shooting willy-nilly and at every civilian vehicle that was passing by. They probably would have shot at vehicles that were appearing to carry supplies or such, because the disruption and the distraction would probably aid in offensive operations elsewhere, as the government would have to deploy military forces, i.e. in this case somewhat paramilitary conscripted police units, to take care of the rebel infiltration, to assure supply lines and also keep the local population more or less well supplied, because to be honest, if the local population wasn't well supplied, things tend to go sideways really rather quickly. So overall, while the sequence seen in the small clip is a wee bit bent, it isn't as bent as some would immediately jump to the conclusion of.
My neighbor called me. There's a massive tank driving down their street and strange men with guns. They're shouting something and coming your way. Anwar, my boy, take care of yourself out there.
A tank? I guess the army is losing its stock pretty quickly. Or else this is another group of deserters.
Anwar, can you hear me? Get out of there or they'll...
Thank you, Grandma. We'll talk again later.
While this may seem weird to anybody familiar with military tactics of the 20th and 21st century, in low-intensity conflicts in general, support from the local population means you have a general idea what's moving where and how. And the elderly woman who's supposedly the grandmother of the protagonist warning the protagonist of a tank rolling down her street coming towards his area, while fantastical in general vibe, would not be too far away from reality. And the fact that a government unit with more or less infantry and light anti-tank weapons and possibly the lightest APCs available from the 1960s and 70s to Soviet allied countries would face tanks. That was kind of the situation back then in 2012 in that general area. If memory serves, there was two major offensives in the 2012-2013 period from the rebels against the Syrian government, which were pretty much the do or die time for the rebel cause, so to say. If they managed to take in Damascus and either killed or driven Assad out of his palace, the Syrian Civil War would have probably gone on with the whole Libyan general model of replacing the government, and the government not really working out too well because there's multiple competing interests and not everybody wants the same things. Like, for example, the Islamists want either an Islamic caliphate as with ISIS or an Islamic republic with some of the more moderate Islamists, which kind of sounds like an oxymoron, but they do exist, towards the moderates who wanted a democracy, and the other guys who just wanted Assad out because either they didn't like him, they thought he was an oppressive bastard, or possibly for their own interest, i.e. grabbing power, so to say. Also, the mention of desertion in the ranks of the military is well documented in that period of time. It still happens from time to time, even now in 2017, but it's much more rare because the war has gradually gone from a civil war more or less to a total war type situation in a localized conflict with international support from outside parties, like for example for Assad's Iran, Lebanon with Hezbollah, and Russia. For the rebels, there's support from Turkey at the very least, and possibly a couple of other NATO allies. It depends on how things actually have progressed. I do know in the 2012 period the support was much more widespread than just Turkey, but it's basically a who's who and who you want to believe. The fact that the rebels had access to a significant amount of ex-Soviet equipment tells me that at the very least there were lords of war passing weapons to the rebels, and at most actual governments passing weapons. Yeah, standard clusterfuck, and it's only gonna get worse. Oh, and the tank that the grandma mentions rolling down the street will be captured by me within the mission, more or less to evidence the fact that within the Syrian conflict in and of itself, innovation, three-dimensional thinking, and non-destructive capture of enemy equipment is very useful. The respective tank will come in quite useful in a later clip you'll see, and also in the next mission, because without it you are basically starting mission 3 versus enemy tanks of T-55, T-62, and I believe even T-72s, but I could be wrong about that. It's been some time since I played mission 3, with no armor of your own besides light APCs like BMPs, BMP-1s, and maybe even BMP-1s with ATGMs, but it's basically a very interesting proposition to start that mission without tanks.
Falcon 4, this is RG2. Come in.
Falcon 4 reads you. I hope you've got good news.
Not exactly. Intelligence from the next village over indicates that the enemy there has a few pickup trucks with multiple rocket launchers. Gifts from the Turks, no doubt. And some armored vehicles, too. Your stubborn streak must have really ticked somebody off over there. The vehicles are coming your way, so be prepared to take some rocket blasts.
Copy that, Hodgie 2. Thanks for the heads up. Over and out. We have intelligence that...
But Commander, there are still civilians using this road.
Lieutenant, we can't be of any help to them dead. We retreat and regroup and counterattack as soon as we get the chance.
The clip itself kinda delves a wee bit into speculation here, because as far as I'm aware the Turks have never provided improvised combat vehicles to the rebels they do support. As far as I'm aware, they've supplied only proper military vehicles like armored personnel carriers or armored fighting vehicles, though the armored fighting vehicles not in the Bradley sort of sense, more like machine gun armored cars basically. So the concept that pickup trucks with rocket launchers mounted on the back have to be Turkish supplied is a wee bit of a leap in logic here. It is possible, but it's more probable that the rebels in question captured rocket batteries of one description or another, because there are a lot of variants available on the Syrian army inventory. Or it's also possible that they either got them from the outside or they actually built them on and of themselves, as improvised rockets are a thing in the Syrian conflict. I believe in 2013 and 2014 rocket-propelled gas canisters filled with explosives started making an appearance, and the government sites have also used elephant rockets, or so-called elephant rockets, which are basically gigantic explosive-filled dumb rockets, surface to surface basically. Aside from that, the view of retreating from an operational area into a strong point is something the Syrian army did quite a bit of in the early stages of the war, The most famous example of this, in my view, is Deri Zor. That's the name of the city. I hope I pronounced that even remotely correctly. Which basically is a army base attached to a city, which survived a siege by ISIS for about 3 years, more or less. They had to gradually fall back ever more, and they lost segments of the city over time, but they managed to actually survive. And within the mission itself, we see a similar sort of scenario at least alluded to.
Vulcan 4, this is RG2. Trying to get a foothold in the mountains. Don't abandon the sector. We're sending you reinforcements. It's everything we have, Falcon. Don't fail us now, Anwar.
Might seem counterproductive to most for a military that's already starting to lack manpower to risk a unit just to maintain a front so another unit can establish a foothold in a mountainous area. However, without that foothold in the mountainous area, there's a high possibility that later on operations to reclaim the area would suffer higher degrees of attrition. The mountain combat within Syria being very ferocious, and more than once ISIS elements have gone to ground in mountains and then popped up and caused sheer havoc behind Syrian army lines. So yeah, that is worth mentioning.
Vulcan 4, this is RG2. I've got new intel for you. Details later, but for now return to your original orders. Clear the intersection. We'll send some extra units your way to help out. Over. Vulcan 4, this is RG2. Come in.
Falcon 4 reads you.
The leader of the sector tells me that the army already knows about the bandits you ran into. They promised to allocate forces to clear the surrounding mountains, but right now, they're bringing in equipment to help the local units defend themselves. The convoy should go through your sector. See to its safe passage.
Are you crazy? I can barely hold my position, never mind guaranteeing safety to a whole convoy.
Vulcan, the situation on the other roads is worse. They're hunting convoys right now. Everyone wants to get their hands on military cargo. Be careful of suicide bombers. We will do all we can to assist you. Without this equipment, we won't be able to assemble self-defense forces in the nearby cities, and the bandits will take over. You must not let that happen. Over and out.
The situation described in the clip we just saw, while fictionalized and quite a wee bit over-dramatized, at least in terms of ratios of soldiers or paramilitary soldiers versus rebels or Islamists, in and of itself it isn't historically inaccurate, because there have been multiple reports of Syrian Arab army soldiers or units taking extraordinary measures to either prevent another unit being overrun or more civilian casualties than absolutely required and such. So in and of itself, the clip is within reason accurate. It's a wee bit propagandized, but not as much as you would think.
They've got suicide bombers and IFBs. We have to slow them down. We cannot let them destroy the convoy.
Convoy attacks remain to this day one of the more preferred tactics of both rebels and Islamists, for the simple fact that it denies supplies to their enemies, i.e. the Syrian Arab army. It also sometimes provides supplies to their own numbers if they don't use suicide bombers against the convoy and blow stuff up. Most convoy attacks tend to be more traditional roadblock type attacks rather than suicide attacks, because, to be honest, for a suicide bomber to actually attack a convoy successfully, especially if it's armed and escorted by vehicles like, for example, in the clip, a IFV, they need the element of surprise. And in general, in the Syrian conflict, the usage of booby-trapped cars, i.e. vehicle-borne IADs, is much rarer than suicide vehicles, so to say, with bombs mounted to them. So the clip itself is a wee bit deceptive in its depiction of the vehicle's use, but in the historical context, it could be possible one of the smaller Islamist factions used it more unknowingly, because basically you'd use the biggest thing you have to throw the problem, and once they lost their tank, which I'm seen using within the clip to great effect, you bring out your next best, which was the IFVs, and then the vehicles, and now the suicide bombers. Suicide bombers in themselves, as mentioned in my previous episode, tend to be used more against entrenched or stationary positions.
Well done, Anwar. The army managed to get that convoy through. There's at least some good news today. Vulcan 4. This is RG2. The convoy got through. The army will be here soon to clean up the last of it. Return to base. Over and out.
The final sequence of the mission shows the protagonist getting orders from his superior to hold a position up until relieved by a military unit shortly, off screen. This sequence is more or less believable because paramilitary units, even if they're made up of former military, well, those military individuals spent X amount of years in civilian life, so they would be less trained or more rusty compared to military units who would have better morale and better capacity to actually hold a position now that it's been more or less secured. So yeah, in and of itself, the final sequence of the mission is more or less accurate. Thank you for watching, or more precisely surviving up until this point, because guys know the editing's kinda interesting and my voice has a melodic tone to it. If you like what you saw, feel free to hit the subscribe button, like button. It does help out the statistics of the channel, gets more visible, you know, stuff like that. And to be honest, at one point I would like to actually make this a job so I can do better content with better quality, more games, more coverage, you know, stuff like that. Take care.